Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Je vois que le nombre de participants est en train d'augmenter progressivement vu que nous venons d'ouvrir le
So
webinaire.
good afternoon, everyone. I can see the number of participants is slowly going up.
Je vais attendre quelques secondes dès que le nombre
So
de
I'm just
participants
going to
sera
wait a
fixé
few
pour
seconds to
amorcer le
see
webinaire.
that everyone is in, and then we'll start the webinar. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being with us in this series on light pollution. I am Céline Damry. I work for the Conservatoire du Littoral, and I'm very happy to be with you. I don't know if you have participated in the previous webinars, and today we'll be talking about recommendations and solutions to protect biodiversity of coastal areas. So before starting, just a little bit of house logistics and how to use the platform. So you can all access the question box. So my colleague Marie will be moderating the questions that you have, and then they will be read and answered. If you need translation, because I'm going to speak French, but our three speakers today are going to speak English, you can press on the little globe and you can click onto English or French, whatever you want to hear the webinar in. And then I would like to remind you that you're being recorded for future broadcasts, so turn off your microphones when you are not speaking. And then we will have the broadcast of this webinar on the channels of the association. So just a small introduction, general introduction on this series. I am part of the Conservatoire du Littoral, which is a French organization. It's a French public institution which acquires parcels of coastline threatened by urbanization or degraded in order to turn them into restored, developed, and welcoming sites that respect the natural balance. We have about 200,000 hectares in France and also in our overseas territories. So we have about 13% of the French coast. We own, in fact, 13% of the French coast, and for managing this coast, we partner with collectivities, with municipalities, associations for the protection of the environment, and we participate together in different projects. Now, also, all these challenges are also tackled with the help of the international delegation, and this is why we hold these webinars to involve all the stakeholders contributing to managing these issues. And you can also see on ICO Solutions past webinars we have organized on different topics like restoration of mangrovias or small islands, etc. So today is a concluding webinar of 3 webinars on light pollution. We've been talking about the biodiversity of ecosystems and about pollution and about methods and tools that we have. Today, we are going to concentrate on recommendations and solutions for limiting light pollution through 3 examples of projects. So I would like to thank the organization staff, Marie, Fanny, and Isabella. My colleague Marie will moderate the question box. Fanny is in the back office, and Isabella is interpreting. So today, we have the following programs: 2 contributions by Kelly and Katya, and after there's going to be a short question and answer session. Then there's going to be a third part by Mania with another 10 minutes question and answer session. And so the total of this webinar, including the closing words, should be 1 hour, 15 minutes. So I would like to thank our speakers today, Kelly, Katya, and Mania. We're going to talk about their examples of their projects and recommendations and solutions. So I will now give the floor to start with to Katya to introduce herself and just give us a quick introduction to her speech.
Hi everyone, I'm Katya and I'm a biologist. I'm the head of Madeira Department of SPEA, the Portuguese Society for the Study of Birds, which belong to the BirdLife network. I live in Madeira Island, and since 2009 I've been working on light pollution and trying to minimize the impact of light pollution on seabirds, but also work on other threats that seabirds face, environmental education, policy. So a bit transversal work that I'm developing at SPEA.
Merci beaucoup, Katya. Mania, je te laisse la parole.
Thank you, Katya. Mania, the floor is yours.
Hi everyone, good afternoon. So my name is Mania. I am the project manager at BirdLife Malta. It is part of the BirdLife International Network. We have one office here in Malta with about 40 staff, 40 very passionate, hardworking people working to conserve seabirds. I've been part of an ongoing project at the moment. We are currently doing some actions on light pollution. However, today I will be speaking about a project that has already closed and was part of our project portfolio a few years ago, where we tackled light pollution. My background is as a conservation biologist, and I have experience working on conservation, specifically working on threats related to fisheries as well, with seabirds and also with turtles in my past life. Thank you, and I look forward to hearing any questions that you may have.
Merci beaucoup, Mania. Et enfin, Kelly.
Thank you, Mania. And now I will give the floor to Kelly and leave her to start up with her contribution, with her presentation.
Par contre, je ne vous entends pas, vous avez votre micro coupé.
Can't hear you, I think you're muted.
Yes.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Kelly Pendoli. I'm a sea turtle biologist and I come to you from Perth, Western Australia. I have been studying the impacts of light on turtles originally since about 1990, so over 30 years. I'm still trying to figure out how to do it. I own a company here in Perth, Western Australia. It's an environmental consultancy that specialises in light pollution, monitoring and modelling of light pollution from a biological point of view, and also sea turtle biology. And the last few years we've started to do a bit more work with seabirds as well because of the impact of light on shearwaters here in Australia. Yeah, you can look at my LinkedIn profile if you want to see anything else about me. So today I'm going to speak to you about some light pollution guidelines that have been released by the Australian Commonwealth Government. So this first page will just show you the links to these guidelines. The top one is the 2023 version, which is updated from a 2020 release. These guidelines were also adopted in 2020 by the United Nations Convention of Migratory Species at their COP13 meeting. That meeting meant that these guidelines were adopted by the 133 signatory states of CMS. And when I checked online, France has been a party since 1990. So technically, France is signatory and can use these guidelines. The guidelines specifically focused on marine turtles, seabirds, and migratory shorebirds in the 2020 version. In a recent update, they now focus on bats, terrestrial mammals, and ecosystem function as well. I also need to acknowledge the different groups that contributed to these guidelines are originally hosted by the Commonwealth Government of Australia, the Department of Environment and Water, but also the WA Department of Conservation. I actually drafted the first version of the guidelines, so I participated, and then the National Environment Science Program. And I also need to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country from which I'm speaking to you from, and acknowledge their continuing relationship to lands here in Australia. Next. So the guidelines originally came from a meeting of a group of biologists, sea turtle biologists, and state and Commonwealth wildlife agencies in Brisbane in about 2014. I couldn't really remember, but I know it was a long time ago. And at that point, we were trying to look at the threats to Australian sea turtles and what we could do about them. And we realised that we could do something about light pollution by producing some guidelines. So originally, they were focused on listed and migratory species because those were the species under Commonwealth law and international treaties that were protected. So we could actually do something about those. And we also wanted to raise the issue of light as a pollutant because at that point, people weren't recognising light as a pollutant. We wanted to be able to provide regulators with a guidance document that they could refer to in the absence of any law. So light pollution still isn't recognised as a legal pollutant, but we figured if we put some guidelines out there, we could give regulators something that they could point to and say, you need to deal with this issue. We also wanted to educate people. We wanted to educate industry, environmental scientists and managers about, in oil and gas and ports, to sort of make them aware that their light was having an impact on wildlife. We wanted to educate lighting manufacturers with the release of LEDs that were replacing the traditional lights. They weren't aware of how bad they were impacting wildlife. We wanted to give regulators knowledge about light when they were assessing and approving these proposals and developments. Councils are the ones that are responsible for a lot of this lighting with street lighting and commercial lighting, and they weren't aware of how badly they were impacting wildlife either. And also scientists and researchers, hoping that they could kickstart some research into this issue because for a long time there wasn't very much. Next. So really, because these came out of the Department of Wildlife in the Commonwealth Government, the overarching aim was to manage light so it protected this wildlife so that it wasn't disrupted or displaced from important habitats, and also that these species could undertake these critical behaviours such as foraging, reproduction and dispersal. So that was the underpinning aim for these guidelines. So the content of these guidelines is fairly simple. It's a handbook to use if you're looking at projects that have potential to impact on wildlife. They include a section on best practice lighting design principles. Very basic, everyone knows what they are, but they're very simple. They're outlined in there. We gave some information on lighting theory and the language around light, because if you don't understand that, you don't really understand how to talk about light to other people. We talked about how to measure biologically relevant light. So commercial light instruments do not measure the light that wildlife can see. We also wanted to talk about how to measure the biological impacts of light on wildlife. We talked about the environmental impact assessment process, because again, if you're not an environmental scientist, people don't really understand that. And we also provided a list of appendices that had specific recommendations and advice on how to manage light for different species. Next. So when I talked about the best practice lighting principles, this is a really important part of these guidelines. And it's things that everyone knows about, but it's things that we need to explain to people when we're talking about light pollution. So start with a dark area. Only add the light you need. If you don't need it, don't add it. Using adaptive controls and timers, motion sensors, things like that. shielding and focusing light onto those target areas that you need, not letting it spew out into the atmosphere. Avoid overlighting. So we found here in Australia, standards for street lighting had the minimum amount of light they needed to make it safe for pedestrians and cars to drive around, but there was no upper limit. So there's no upper limits, means that they'll just use as many lights as they need. Minimize light intensity. If you don't need a bright white light and can get away with a nice dim orange light, then that's what you should use. Avoid reflecting light off bright surfaces. So a big, bright, polished marble wall is going to reflect a lot of light. You don't want that. And using lights with reduced or filtered blue. So if anyone saw my first presentation, it was all about blue wavelengths. And that's the biggest impact on wildlife, of those blue wavelengths. So, we recommend you use amber or PC amber LEDs. Aim for a color temperature of 2700 or less, and that will reduce your blue light. Next. So what are the practical implementation of these guidelines? So what these guidelines don't have any legal, they have no legal value. You can't take someone to court if they don't comply with the guidelines. But what the regulators have done is that they assess a project, and in assessing a project, they will say to the proponent, you must make sure that your project and your lighting is consistent with the guidelines. You must show that you have assessed your light and managed your light that complies with these guidelines. So indirectly, it gives it some legal authority. What we've seen here in Australia in the past 2 years is the number of projects has just grown exponentially. Every project, every port development, mining development, urban development is now being required to assess their project and show how they comply with these lighting guidelines. The original 2020 version of the guidelines addressed sea turtles, migratory seabirds and shorebirds. But in 2023, the Commonwealth Government also released a new version of the guidelines that included these terrestrial mammals, bats, and ecosystem function. But what it's done is it's now driving the guidelines inland. So it means that it's not just turtles and birds that we're having to look at and that the projects are having to assess against. They're now having to look inland as well, which means that bigger areas are being protected from light pollution. Next. So this is my last slide, and I know it looks like a laundry list, but I just wanted to give you guys some examples of some specific projects that we've had to deal with that looked at impacts of light pollution on different developments using these guidelines. So things like urban residential developments have to look at the impacts on turtles. We looked at a river development where a bridge went in over a river with a bunch of lighting on it for driving, and we had to look at that from the impact on swans. A marina development near a nesting beach, a hard rock mining project that had an area near it that wanted to be a dark sky reserve. So we had to look at the impact of their light on that reserve. A battery storage facility that had an Astros tourism facility nearby where tourists came in to look at the stars. A chemical plant that had an Aboriginal rock carving area nearby where Aboriginals had a meeting place. And because Aboriginals tell their stories in the stars, and if they can't see the stars, that impacts on their ability to tell their stories and their heritage values. There were oil and gas developments with marine turtles, seabirds, and migratory shorebirds nearby, ports, salt mining, wind farms are the most recent ones, which potential impacts on seabirds from the lights, not just the spinning, whatever they are called. And then more and more, we're getting international projects that are coming to us drilling in FPSO projects off Suriname. There is a French company doing some of that out there, and we're having to look at the impacts of light on turtles and birds out there. Island resort developments in the Red Sea, Saudi Arabia, a whole lot of those happening. And I'm doing a lot of work with NGOs in Oman, Brazil, Cape Verde, places like this, looking at the impacts of turtles with tourist developments and the light from those. So light pollution, it's a big issue, and more internationally, people are starting to look at these impacts and using these guidelines. So it gives me some hope that we're getting somewhere with all this. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Kelly.
Thank you, Kelly, for this presentation. So please do write your questions in the chat box. I possibly have one question to ask you. In terms of all these projects that you have described and the assessments of those projects, what happens in the territories where this awareness is spread? Do you think there is already some kind of awareness for these projects?
So in Australia, it's growing, definitely. If there's potential impact on a listed species like a turtle, people now understand they have to look at this. But what I'm interested in seeing is this overseas focus on light. Okay. Right. And I don't know where that's coming from, whether it's coming from the CMS guidelines or just companies have an understanding of their social responsibility, and that light pollution is another form of pollution they have to deal with as part of their social responsibility and social license to operate. And I get that feeling that's what a lot of this is, because it's not always regulation. They're doing it because they feel like they need to do this.
Merci beaucoup, Kelly. Restez connectés. On reviendra à l'antenne tout à l'heure dans la dernière session.
Thank you, Kelly. Please stay connected because you will be part of the next Q&A session. So now we will give the floor to Katia, who is going to talk about the projects in Madeira. Floor is yours.
Hi again. Thank you for the opportunity to share our work that we are developing not only in Madeira, but in the Macaronesia archipelagos. Next one, please. Well, at Macaronesia, in the last 15 years, we are working in order to mitigate and minimize the impact of light pollution in Macaronesia. Within several projects, we have been working with the municipalities in order to create some recommendations for lightening the streets. We've developed forums and workshops, environmental education, and of course, rescue campaigns to save as many seabirds as possible. And we saved more than several thousands of birds that were affected by light pollution. More recently, in 2021, we started two conservation projects with a specific focus on light pollution. Next. So along this process, we rapidly understood and realized that we needed a broader alliance in order to halt the problem of light pollution. We cannot work alone. It is important to have a multidisciplinary team to act in several areas of the light pollution mitigation. And within this project, we are working with 13 partners from research institutes, enterprises related with light efficiency, NGOs, government with responsibility on biodiversity management, and of course municipalities that are in charge of the light, the illumination of the cities. Next one, please. In Life Nature at Night, which is the name of our conservation project, we are trying to protect night and promote the nocturnal life in protected areas, and of course not only, also in the cities. We are developing several actions. Mainly, some of the preparatory actions were related to the study of impacts of light pollution on biodiversity. As we already know, seabirds, bats, and moths are attracted by light pollution, and within this project, we are trying to sample and increase the knowledge about the impacts that light pollution might have on these groups. We are collecting samples of insects. We are trying to monitor the changes on street lighting to see the impacts of the different type of illumination on bats and on insects. We are putting some GPS devices on birds to see, while they are flying, which kind of lights are attracting more birds, and in which part of the reproductive cycle also, because adults and juveniles can have different types of behaviors in front of light, because it is important to standardize the problem response, and we are trying to create a framework to reduce the impact of light pollution on biodiversity. So this study part it has been a very important part of our project. Next one, please. As I explained in the first episode, in Macaronesia we have 10 breeding species of seabirds, 9 species of endangered bats, and also several hundreds of moth species that are attracted by light pollution. Of course, we are trying to work on new solutions for public lighting, because it's important to protect these endangered species, mainly seabirds and bats. And we are also trying to act, or we are acting on minimizing the direct impact by reducing the light pollution, but also we are trying to continue and motivate people to help us on the rescue campaigns. Every year we are searching for birds on more than 2,000 kilometers of transects in order to recover and rescue as much seabirds as possible. We are involving several volunteers that are visiting Macaronesia from several countries in Europe in order to help us to save as much birds as possible, because they are one of the most endangered group of animals in the world. Next one, please. We are also trying to map light pollution. As you remember, the second episode of this webinar were about measuring and different methodologies to measure light pollution in protected areas and even in urban areas. So I will invite you all to revisit this second episode, where my colleague Fernando shared some of the methodologies that we are developing and working in order to map light pollution in Macaronesia. We are mapping light pollution sources in land and also at sea from boats and other structures. And of course, it is a very important part of our work to justify how light pollution in urban areas are affecting the protected areas, because as we are working with the politicians, we constantly have the answer from them explaining that, oh, in our protected areas we don't have light, so there's no light pollution problems. So we need to justify and map that light from urban areas are also affecting the species and the habitats present in protected areas. Next one, please. Of course, to mitigate the impact of light pollution, we are investing on efficient light. Of course, we can achieve this light pollution reduction with the implementation of the municipal public plans for public lighting and local regulations that are being implemented in the several municipalities within this project. We are developing demonstration and pilot actions with new solutions for urban areas lighting. And of course, we are trying to get as much as possible community engagement and involvement in our project. Of course, we are dealing with some difficulties about on relating energy efficiency and other biodiversity-friendly solutions. We are trying to explain that this is a very efficient light with a very high saving potential, and of course, with that, we will be protecting biodiversity. So it is very important, as the majority of the investments now are facing and are with the objective of halting climate change and trying to be energy efficiency. Of course, putting also mitigation and minimization of light pollution in the agenda is one of the main priorities of this project. And of course, I forgot to highlight, besides changing it's not definitively the lights, but besides changing lights in urban areas, we are also promoting some punctual activities like blackouts in cities. And I would like to share with you the great example of Corvo Island, where during the fledgling season, when the juveniles of birds are leaving the nests, the complete island shuts the lights down in order to protect the birds. So this is also some examples of actions that can be implemented in order to reduce light pollution and its effects on biodiversity. Next one, please. Also, a very important part of the project is trying to contribute to the creation of new regulations on light emissions. Of course, this is a very hard topic to be working with. Of course, we are working with the municipalities in order to implement this regulation at a municipal level, and also we are working with politicians in order to influence and try to create some legislation to work on regional and also at national and European level. The management plans of protected areas in Micronesia are also now including regulations for light emissions. So a first step is already accomplished. And we hope that with these actions, Micronesia can be an example for good practices on artificial light at night reduction. Also, on the private sector, we are implementing an award. This is the award Night with Life, and we are trying to promote this award for hotels and restaurants that apply good practices on their external lighting infrastructures. So we are working both with the private and the public sector in order to minimize this this impact on biodiversity. Next one, please. Of course, the final big action, it's one of the most important ones, the awareness. So as we already know, light pollution is a threat for biodiversity and also for the human health. And if we want to achieve long-term results, we need to involve the local communities. We are developing environmental education at schools, training with the municipalities, with technicians, with stakeholders, with architects, engineers, in order to promote best practices on lighting. And we are, of course, trying to promote the energy sustainability, also trying to promote economic benefits by reducing light pollution, and of course ensure the biodiversity conservation of these wonderful species that live in this biogeographical region of Micronesia. And the final slide is just to invite you to visit our website, our project. It has translation for English and Spanish. Sorry, we don't have a French version, but I'm pretty sure that you can understand some of the information that is available online. And of course, if you have any further questions, I'm pleased to answer to you. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Katia, pour cette présentation très introductive.
Thank you, Katya, for your wonderful presentation on your project. We've seen you have so many different activities, so many recommendations, and you were talking about tourism, and is this something that you, this label, are there international labels similar to the one you develop on best practices?
Yes, actually, there is an international award, which is the Dark Sky Association, that promotes areas with protected nights, but the requirements are very high and they are quite difficult to achieve. Looking at the situation in Micronesia, because actually we are all the 3 archipelagos have big pressure on tourism, and coastal areas have a huge amount of light pollution. Around 70% of the light pollution is on the coastal area and is from the urban areas and of course the touristic infrastructures. So we try to promote a smaller award to make, and we have like 3 steps, like the gold, platinum, and several steps where the entities can adhere, can apply. And we are trying to promote smaller adjustments on the light, because we know this is a new topic. It's not a new topic, but we have some resistance at the beginning when we are trying to promote these good practices on the private sector. So we want just a door slightly open so we can we start working with them and trying to convince them. Of course, the first, the main preoccupation from their side is about the energy savings and the economic benefits. But of course, as we are in a very touristic area and our tourists are also aware of biodiversity problems, we are trying to convince them that also this award can create some preference on their clients. So actually, we are hoping to achieve many hotels here in Madeira, Azores, and Canary Islands in order to minimize the amount of light pollution in the coastal area in all 3 archipelagos, which is quite significant.
Merci beaucoup, Katia.
Thank you, Katya. Now we're going to get to the Q&A session. So I invite Kelly to come back. And yes, I have a question from Anthony. He works in a small company, electric company, with private, with households and administrations. So what could be the first actions or efforts that we could take in our installations to reduce light pollution? Kelly, what could be the first recommendation to give to these small businesses?
Yes, to Anthony. And I think this is Anthony that I know from a few years ago. He used to live with me. So Anthony, you can look at those guidelines and look at those recommendations on how to manage your lighting. Reduce your intensity, focus your lights downwards, use low color temperature, orange lights rather than bright white lights. So they're very basic guidance. If you can see the light shining in your eyes from outside of a house, then that's not good. It needs to be, if you stand on the boundary of your property, you shouldn't be able to see a light. And that's a good guide for how to manage your lighting.
Merci Kelly. Est-ce que
Thank you, Kelly. Katya, would you like to add something to this question?
Sorry. Yeah, I think that one of the first things to do is like an internal audit to see and to evaluate some simple actions that we can implement in our infrastructures. The experience that I have is it starts with turning off external lights. So sometimes the investment on changing light is on the second step, but at least reducing some extra light, some additional light that it's not necessary. It's one of the first steps, and actually it can create some savings in order to invest on the second stage. I can share the example of some of the municipalities here in Madeira that already created a municipal plan for public lighting, and now they have like an investment project with several phases. The first phase, they could just turn off some of the lights, and with the savings and the economic benefits of turning off those lights, they already are they are already available to invest on acquiring new kind of lights that can promote and can be implemented in other sensitive areas or areas where we actually need to have those kind of lights. So looking in a very critical way to our facilities and see where we can change is always the first step.
Merci beaucoup pour votre réponse à toutes les deux. Peut-être qu'on pourra mettre
Thank you for your answers. Maybe we will put the link to the guidelines by Kelly in the chat so everyone can refer to them. Another question is, what topics would you use to convince local populations to reduce their lights? Katja, what would be a good argument?
Well, as I told you before, the first step is talking about economic benefits. No one likes to pay for light that it's completely wasted. So this was the first communication channel with the municipalities. And after we're talking about the economic benefits, of course, talking about some health problems that can be minimized by reducing the excessive light. And of course, with the investment in environmental education, also some citizens are aware about the importance of protecting biodiversity. So I think this is all three important topics to use in our communication: economy saving, health, and of course the biodiversity protection. I think it's the most important message.
Merci. J'aurais une autre question
Thank you. I have another question. Someone wants to know if there are examples of islands or municipalities, Katja, you've already talked about it, who do some blackouts in a part of the night. Maybe you can answer to this question.
Yeah. Okay, besides Corvo, but it's a really small island with around 300 inhabitants. So they turn off the lights during 5 days. During 5 days, they turn off the lights in order to protect the birds. Of course, in Corvo, it's easier to implement because it's a smaller island, but also in bigger islands, we can follow their example and be inspired by their actions. Actually, here in Madeira, in the 5 municipalities that we have in the project, from Santana to Câmara de Lobos, in the eastern part of Madeira Island, we are promoting blackouts in the peak season of the juveniles of Cory Shearwater. On the 30 of October, we turn the lights off in some areas, trying to create some black corridors so birds can go to the ocean with minimal impacts. Of course, this is just a small action, but we believe that, and when applied in the most dangerous nights, because birds, they leave their nests within a difference of 5-6 days. And we have like the peak day where they leave the nests, And if we could create a blackout on that night, the result can be really, really significant and inspiring, of course.
Merci beaucoup, Katia, pour ces précisions. On va
Thank
passer.
you, Katya, for those details. Now we're going to get to the last presentation, and then we are going to have more questions and answers after Mania's presentation. And thank you, Kelly, also for your answers. So thank you both. And now time is running fast. There's more questions, but now I need to give the floor to Mania Russo, and we'll answer to more questions later. Mania, the floor is yours to talk about BirdLife Malta and the conservation of birds.
Hi everyone, thank you for giving me the floor. I'll just start my video. As I mentioned earlier, I work with BirdLife Malta, which means that my presentation is going to be focused on a light pollution project that was aimed to support the conservation of birds, and specifically on seabirds. So I will start by actually mentioning to you the seabirds that we are working on. I think it's important to appreciate why we are doing this work on light pollution and why these species are so special. So next slide. So basically the next slide. Yes, thank you. So basically, the Yelkowon shearwater was the focus species of the project. Now, obviously, light pollution is going to affect multiple species. So indirectly, we were also benefiting other species. But we wanted to focus on the Yelkowon shearwater because it is a species that breeds on our cliff faces. And its colonies are very exposed to the light pollution from the coastline. Just to give you a bit of context for those who are not from Malta, Malta is a very small island and has a very large, it's got a very large population, and it is subject to a lot of development, especially in recent years, which means that light pollution has continued to be a very important threat for us to address. So just to give you an idea, that bird in the picture over there is the Yelkowon shearwater. I'm sure people that come from other Mediterranean countries are familiar with this bird as well. It is a medium-sized seabird. It is about it's got about 39 centimeters in body length and has tube-shaped nostrils with a long beak. As you can see from that picture, it is a dark beak. It's got basically glands in its nostrils which allow it to filter salt water, so it kind of has a reverse osmosis system in its nostrils, and what this means is it can spend a long time at sea. It actually touches ground during the breeding season only. So this could mean that a seabird sometimes could last up to 5 years out at sea without touching land at all, because it is so well adapted. Just like other seabirds, of course, as well do this. Now in Malta, we have about 10% of the global population that breed on our island and breed within the specific colonies. So how does light pollution affect these birds? Well, first of all, light pollution means that these the Yelkowons need darkness to be able to return to their burrows, to their colonies, and if the cliff face is very highly illuminated, then this will affect their behavior and will stop them from entering their nests. Do bear in mind that, like many seabirds, these species do not lay many eggs. In fact, the Yelkowon shearwater will only lay one egg a year, and if this egg is lost, it will not carry out another breeding attempt. So it is very important that when pairs are coming to look for the colonies to create their nest and to breed, it is important that this is successful. If a high percentage of these don't manage to do that, it can severely impact the population. So of course, not being able to find a burrow, as I am saying, reduces the success of raising a chick. And the light, once a chick starts to grow and becomes a teenager or a juvenile, so they're at a point where they are ready to leave the nest and fledge, if there is a lot of light facing the colony, or close enough to the colony, what will happen is it will leave the nest and become disorientated, because essentially they use natural light as a navigating cue. So if there is a lot of light, what will happen is that these seabirds become stranded. And when they become stranded, they become susceptible to starvation, to dehydration, to also predation by cats and dogs. So it is really important that not only do we consider the impact it has on the colonies, but also on the fledglings, on the young seabirds that are leaving to take their first flight at sea. So this is something about the Elco and Shearwater, and this was the species we were focused on when we were doing the light pollution project, which was called Life Archipelago Garnia. So next slide, please. This particular project was looking at different objectives. So one of the things that we did was that we created a map where we highlighted the threats in the different areas. So if you can see, that is all of Malta. So it is, as I said, a very small island, and it allowed us to be able to survey the whole island and all the colonies in this project. And we mapped out the threats. And I'm not sure if it is clear to you all, but where there is the light bulb symbol, that shows that those areas are susceptible to light pollution. So you can see that there is quite a few. What we did aside, so we were monitoring the population, so we monitored the different nesting sites. We also did some actions to reduce the populations of rats in the area, which are also a threat to seabirds. But on this topic in particular, what we did was we worked with local stakeholders to reduce the light pollution in the area, and also noise pollution. We have, as many islands, we have a very big maritime industry, we have a very big tourism industry, and that means that there are lots of boats around. So in peak times, which due to the weather and due to climate change, there are tourists almost all year round in Malta these days. This means that there is a lot of disturbance that comes from boats through light and noise pollution. And these move usually quite close to the cliff sides. Something else that we also did was, of course, work with the general public. Light pollution is something that people do not associate as being a threat to seabirds. In fact, when we spoke to people about this particular threat, most weren't aware. So there is a lot of work that still needs to be done to educate the public on this topic and really get them to understand that lights are actually detrimental to wildlife. Next slide, please. So what we did was we had a pilot site, which is called the Chirkawa Ferry Terminal. This particular terminal is where boats are crossing between the two islands, the two smaller islands of Malta. So this ferry is operational all year round. It moves every 20 minutes in a day, so it is constantly operational. And this particular ferry terminal was very, very illuminated, with a lot of excessive lighting. So what we did was we identified that particular place as a pilot site to change the lighting in that area. And we managed actually to change the lighting in this particular terminal. So by the end of the project, we not only had a commitment, but we also had the changes made at the Chirkawa Ferry Terminal. However, that was not the end of the story, and I will tell you in the next few slides what happened after a few years that this project finished. Something else that we did was we measured the the night sky brightness, and we identified the sources of light pollution. And then from there, we identified other areas which would benefit from lighting changes. As you can see in that picture there of the tower, that one was after the changes were made. That tower was very heavily illuminated with lots of lights facing upwards into the tower. And by the end of it, we only ended up having one one light left at that particular tower. So that was a very big win. This tower is found in an area which is almost completely devoid of any residents or any houses, because it is on a cliffside, and it is a very beautiful touristic attraction and a very beautiful place in general for the Maltese public. But it was, again, very badly lit. And it is in an area which in general would have been perfect for star gazing and for obviously a lot of wildlife that live in the area. So this one was quite a big win for us as well. And we also made changes on some touristic areas which are mentioned there, which is Zurriq, Irdum al-Ammih, Arlapsi, Nadur, and Shlendi. So these were all the areas where, in some way or another, we managed to have some changes, slight changes made to the lighting. Something else which we released was the guidelines for ecologically responsible lighting, which mirrors a lot the kind of recommendations that Kelly mentioned in her presentation at the start. So we obviously used a lot of examples from other countries and came up with this very easy to understand guidance for people to take on board, even for their households, for their hotels or establishments or businesses. Next slide. So something else which we did was understand the policy gap. So as also mentioned by the other presenters, there is a very big gap in law when it comes to light pollution. In Malta, there is actually no particular law that dictates to an establishment how they should light the exterior of the buildings. So we carried out a gap analysis so that we can really have more targeted messaging to policymakers and advocate for changes where they were needed. What we came up with was a policy recommendation document, which we presented to the authorities for it to be developed into Maltese law. Unfortunately, this hasn't been adopted. However, these guidelines are still referred to by the environmental authorities. So for us, we felt that this was obviously a very big win. Something else which we did was we carried out an analysis on the stranded seabirds in particular areas for us to understand whether there was an increase or a decrease in these strandings. And as you can see from that graph on the side, the number of grounded seabirds increased with increasing light pollution. So we had a very clear correlation on light pollution and strandings of seabirds. Next slide, please. So what happened after the project? So we kept on monitoring. We are still monitoring the Elkhorn Shear waters through different projects, and we are still carrying out awareness raising activities about light pollution. We are also doing more seabird rescue and rehabilitation. So we have also improved our capacity to take seabirds into a rehabilitation center when they are stranded, get them back to health, because usually stranded seabirds are quite weak and need some time to recover. So what we do is we take them, we give them time to recover, feed them, let them rest, and then we release them. And this usually happens within a day or two. So the rehabilitation isn't very long at all. What we have continued doing is carrying out advocacy work. So we essentially objections whenever there are new developments if lighting hasn't been considered in the development plan. So we are very active and proactive in providing information to the authorities and to developers on what kinds of guidance they should follow. And we work very closely with the authorities to do this as well. This does take a lot of work, so in the long term, it would be ideal if this becomes more of an automatic approach rather than needing so much intervention from us, because it is very difficult to keep up with every bit of development and step in for every new development that comes up on the coastal area specifically. Next slide. Okay, so this is a picture of the Chirkawa terminal before we changed the light. So as you can see, there was a lot of lighting, and this was the pilot site. However, the bad news is that after a few years that the light got changed, the management of the area changed, the management of the ferry terminal changed, and the lights were returned back to the bad ones. So new floodlights were placed. So now we are essentially back to the beginning. And we are now yet again pushing for the Chiricahua ferry terminal for the lights to go back to the good lights which were changed after this particular project. So one of the things that is really important is the continued engagement. Even after a project is finished, working with stakeholders is very important, because when places change hands or change management, these things are likely not to remain in place. Something else that we are doing is basically having light pollution as we are working with the authorities, because light pollution is now included as a national conservation measure. So we are working with authorities to retrofit certain areas, and this is again under a national umbrella. So this is something which we hope in the long term will be a bit more sustainable in terms of being kept. And finally, we are looking for funding to better understand light pollution and the impact that it has on seabirds. We have a suspicion that burrows that have light inside, that the light reflects inwards deep within the burrow, it will reduce the chance of occupancy. So we would like to do further studies to understand whether light intensity within the colonies themselves is having a large or a small effect on whether they become occupied by breeding pairs. So this is still an ongoing work. However, it's important to point out that light pollution is something that needs to consistently be worked upon. Thank you, and that is it from my side.
Merci beaucoup, Mania. On atteint l'heure de webinaire, donc on va glisser.
Thank you, Mania. We are getting to the end of the seminar, so we're going to do another question and answer section now. So have you got some recommendations and guideline on your projects? And you've spoken to us about this, but how do you make this sustainable? How do you make these last in the different sectors? We've been talking about, municipalities and research and industry. So how do you make sure these recommendations are taken and that they last in time? So, Kelly?
Is that for me to answer or for Kelly?
Mania, à vous d'abord, et je laisserai ensuite la parole à Kelly et à Katia.
Yes, you can answer first, Mania, and then I will give the floor to Kelly and Katia.
So the short answer is that it's very difficult to ensure sustainability. As I said, the Chiricahua terminal, which was one of our pilot sites, which we felt was a success, after a few years, it changed again, and it was not kept, even although the changes were made. So in short, there is no way to ensure the sustainability of results unless it becomes legislation, unless it becomes law. And not only that, it needs to have good enforcement and monitoring from the government level and the national authorities. As an NGO, the only thing we can do is be reactive or be proactive with providing recommendations and guidelines. However, there is no way that a small NGO can follow up with each and every local council and each and every stakeholder to ensure that they are maintaining their promises. So I think the trick here is to do advocacy and policy work to be able to push for it to become national legislation. Otherwise, you don't have any chance of it keeping and remaining in the long term.
Merci. Kelly, Katia, un complément?
Thank you, Kelly and Katia. Would you like to make a comment? Do you have the same feelings as Mania?
No, because here in Australia, those guidelines form part of the regulatory approval for projects. And so that means that proponents have to show how their light is not impacting on wildlife. They have to do annual monitoring. They have to provide triggers to show that the wildlife is behaving the way it should be behaving. under the influence of that light. And technically, if they're not behaving that way, they have to either, in the short term, manage their lights better, identify the problem and fix it. And in the longer term, technically, and it hasn't happened, but technically, the whole project could be shut down till the problem is fixed. So because the guidelines I spoke about, they have no regulatory power in themselves, but the regulators are using them as part of their approvals for these projects. So it's early days here in Australia, but we are definitely seeing them being implemented that way by the regulator.
Merci, Katia.
Well,
Katia?
the situation in Australia is quite
La situation
inspiring. I wish
en
that
Australie est
that we could have the same situation. But as many said, the recommendations are important, but we need to work on effective plans with regulation, at least at the municipal level. And of course, then ensure that there is fiscalization in order to see if the entities are following the regulation. It's very important that these guidelines became law. Then also to ensure our good results, it is important to keep up with environmental education and community engagement, because if we have the citizens demanding for action from the political level, it's a very important result and a way to make pressure in the future. Actually, after we started this project, we are receiving several contacts from citizens that are complaining, oh, in a parking from a restaurant, there is too much light and it's affecting our house. So if we invest on working on environmental education and the community, the citizens' engagement, I believe that it's also a way to push and try to maintain the good results that we can achieve within these conservation projects.
Merci, Katia. Marie,
Thank you, Katia.
relever quelques questions de la boîte à questions, ce qu'on a reçu en parallèle via WhatsApp.
Marie, I leave you with maybe a few questions in the chat box. Yes, there is one about the associations, the astronomic associations that were mentioned for the protection of the starry skies. Someone was wondering whether you can create associations with them so that they can help you spread awareness and do some advocacy. I don't know who wants to answer first.
I can answer that one. I was vice president of the International Dark Sky Association for 3 years. And it's an American-based group that certifies dark skies. It is really hard to get that certification. And I've found, as being a member of that, on that board for 6 years, that it works a lot better in America. And usually in Europe, South America, Australia, it didn't have quite the power that it has in North America. And I think, a lot of local dark sky movements probably have more power and more ability to make changes. But I think leveraging off the IDA does have some value if you can use what they're recommending. But I think here in Australia, we've started up a dark sky group here because there's a lot of issues around lighting that if you're going to recommend lights that they're different, like, power and specifications of lights and fixtures. And if you get real technical, they're different in America to what they are in Europe and Australia and the Middle East and Africa. And so when you get down to the detail of those sorts of things, it's better to have, I think, a local focus than like an IDA thing. But there's still some value in the resources they can provide and education materials. And for some countries, there's a lot of, you know, people respect another country's opinion. You know what I mean? It's like, it seems to be more important if you know, an American group says it's good. So IDA has a place. I think you just need to figure out how to use it.
Well, here in Madeira, we also work with the local astronomy association. Of course, we are dealing with the same threats in our work. So we develop environmental education actions together, and we also create some activities, outdoor activities for and doing the blackouts, trying to listen to the seabirds and also watching the stars. So it's quite inspiring for the participants in the activities. Also within Life Nature at Night, we have a partner, which is the Astrophysics Institute from the Canary Islands, that are also involved in the project and working on the measurement of light pollution emissions in a more scientific way. So of course, it is always helpful to share the problem with other researchers and other associations, because light pollution is affecting, as we see all over these 3 episodes, it's affecting several areas. So joint effort is very important.
Was a similar case in Malta. If I could just jump in. We've worked with different stakeholders and including an astronomy group as well, and we have done a lot of activities with them as well. I think, yes, in a very similar context to Katya's, we have been able to have some good support from some of the stakeholders, including the transport authorities, for example, that are responsible for boating, maritime activities, bunkering activities, and things like that.
Merci beaucoup pour vos réponses à toutes les trois. Une autre
Thank
question.
you. Thanks to all 3 of you for your answers. Another question, change in subject, more on a geographical side of things. What about the the energetic crisis and the economic crisis that is touching Europe, and this has brought about obviously a reduction of artificial light. Yes, we're talking about Europe, but probably this is also something that concerns other geographies.
So can I jump in?
Do you think this had an influence on the reduction of light pollution?
No, because LEDs are very cheap to run. They're cheap to buy, they're cheap to run. And so lighting designers, if they're going to design a new whatever facility, will grab a lot more lights than they normally would have because they're cheap. So the energy costs are not as bad as it used to be with the old legacy lighting. High pressure sodium, fluorescence, halogens were a lot more expensive to run. And so that's a problem. Not only are they putting more lights in, but they're putting in LEDs, which have more blue light in them. So the old lights didn't have as much. So that's why we're seeing the amount of light pollution going up. It's because we've got these LEDs that have a lot more blue light in them, which have a greater impact on wildlife and humans and things like that. So yeah, it's like, it's a really hard argument to make that it costs more money because you've got more light shining, because the engineers will go, actually, there's not that much, and we can put more lights in and spend the same amount of money. So that's the problem you've got to deal with there.
Merci Marie. Est-ce qu'on a une dernière question dans la boîte parce qu'on a débordé du temps?
Thank you, Marie. Do we have a last question because we are out of time? Yes, maybe this one. what do you think about making the starry sky, the dark sky part of the UNESCO World Heritage? Would this help spreading awareness?
Qui se lance?
Yes.
Qui a une idée? Ouais.
Who is going to answer to this one?
Yes, yes. But how do you do it? It's like getting to the the right people in UNESCO and someone knowing someone who can tap them on the shoulder and say, you need to pay attention to this. So yeah, for sure. And there is, there's a lot going on in Europe and United Nations. Those guidelines, our guidelines, the CMS guidelines, are now, they're part of the United Nations, but most people don't know it. They don't recognise it as they're signatories to CMS, and they are signatories to those guidelines. 133 countries. So France is one. Did you guys know that? Did you know that you have these guidelines? You're signatory to it? No.
Merci beaucoup à toutes les trois. Je pense que je vois pas d'autres questions.
Thanks, everyone. I don't see any more questions. There's a comment saying that yes, they are putting more LED lights because of the energy crisis, and they are putting more LED lights. This is exactly what Kelly was saying. So thank you for this comment. I think that we are getting to the end of our webinar. So thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Katia. Thank you, Manya. And thanks everyone for staying until the end. So we have finished with a webinar. Just in a few days, you're going to be able to check on the ICO Solution website and you'll see the recording of this webinar. And we are going to have a new series of webinars in June. So don't hesitate to access and sign up for this new series of webinars on coastal observing systems. Thank you for being with us.